Good afternoon, everyone, from Dunrobin Ranch in Lolo, Montana. It's a gorgeous Thursday afternoon, and with me today I have Cherie, our own Osprey expert. Hi,
Hello.
Cherie. Hi.
Hello.
We're going to be talking about osprey and fish today, and about the fish in the Bitterroot River and how they relate to our wonderful ospreys, and how our wonderful ospreys are just adapted to be expert fishermen. And I think all of you have seen that with Swoop this year. He's been bringing in the fish just right and left. At the close of our program, I'm going to share with you a recent incident here in Montana that I think all of you will find very interesting. Many of you are on Facebook, and this is something that Montana Ospreys shared on their Facebook page. But for those of you who don't, I think you'll find it a very interesting little incident. So I'll follow up with that at the end, and those of you who already know the story can wave goodbye and move on. But I think others of you will be interested in it. So Cherie's going to start our program today with a PowerPoint about the various adaptations that ospreys have over the bird world with respect to catching fish. So take it away, Cherie.
All right. Yes, I would love to share with you all what makes ospreys so unique that they are actually given their own taxonomic genus and family because of their unique adaptations and behavior. Let's go on to present mode. So, osprey are very talented fishermen. I enjoyed this photo a lot because, as you can see, he has two fish, which I think is just quite impressive. Their diet, so they feed almost exclusively on fish. Um, Before new chicks migrate, have always been eating fish caught out of local rivers and lakes. So what are these adaptations that we're talking about that help them catch fish? Going from top to bottom, we'll start with the sharply hooked bill, as you can see on two of our chicks from this year, and also Iris from the Hellgate nest. They really have that nice pointed long beak that helps them tear apart the fish flesh. The other cool thing about the bill is that their nostrils can actually close when they go into the water to help keep water out when they're diving. As for feathers, they have denser and more oily plumage than other birds of prey, which just helps them make them waterproof and can shake off the water easier so that they're not super heavy when they're trying to lift back out of the water with a fish. Their wings, they have very long wings, and they're narrower in relative to body size than other raptors. And this is just for, again, that lift coming out of the water. It's also less surface area for them to get waterlogged in the feathers. They can fully submerge when they dive for a fish, I believe up to 2 feet. Chat, please correct me on that if I am wrong. And their legs, I think this is one of my favorites. They have just these wildly long legs that allow for increased reach into the water. They are the only raptor that dives feet first, tucked like you can see in these diagrams. And that helps keep the fish in sight in front of their feet while they're diving. They have a really great vision for spotting the fish and then for following through on that dive. And this position also helps protect their head. So as you can see, they are a very interesting shape with the wings when they enter the water, and those feet, which we'll talk about next, and kind of like a basket stance. For the feet, this is one of the coolest parts. The feet, they are big, and they have those hook talons that help grab because fish are very slimy, slippery. They have a reversible toe, so that outer toe can either go forward or backwards. And when they're carrying fish, I believe they have 2 toes in front and 2 toes in back. They also have, and you can see in the top right picture the best, these little needle-like spines that are on the bottom of their toes that help really grip that fish, and they're called spicules, I think, and that is unique to ospreys. So when they're carrying the fish, they can use those toes to align it parallel with their body, with the head facing forward, and that makes for much better flight aerodynamics. And here I have just a comparison of a bald eagle and an osprey. You can see just how streamlined they are, how they can manage to go into the water instead of just skim the top. And then the bottom photo there, you can see how they are gripping that fish. I think from here, I have just a quick overview of fish that appear on the nest here at Dunrovin in Northwest, where are we at? Northwest Montana? Western Montana? Yeah. So we have some of the native fish, a couple of trout, some others, and then some non-native fish, more trout and bass and pike. So let's get more into that. I will hand it over to Suzanne, unless anybody has any specific questions about those adaptations.
Excuse me. I don't see any questions yet. I was going to add, Cherie, that another really interesting part of the foot is that it is the clenched position is the relaxed position, which is the opposite of our hands. When we clench our hands, we have to use the muscles to make them clenched. And it's just the opposite on osprey, which you will notice that when the birds come and bring a fish to the chicks, sometimes they have a hard time letting go. And the fish are pulling it, trying to get it out of the parents' toes and feet. And that's because they have to release it. It's not an easy thing to do. I mean, it's not just automatic, which I think is a really cool thing about them as well. And they're just cool as can be. Celia wanted to point out that osprey are also one of the few birds that actually shake like a dog. When they come out of the water, they will be flying, and in flight, they will shake to get rid of that extra weight of the water that they've collected. And I think they're one of the only birds that does that, if I'm not correct. So I would like to share with you a video that we did last year during our Awesome Osprey project. We had invited a man named Tori Ritter, who is the local wildlife biologist in this area, to come out and give us some pointers about how to identify the fish that come out of the Bitterroot River. And there's a wide range of fish, as Cherie indicated, that do come out of the Bitterroot River, both native and non-native. But I asked Tori Ritter if he wouldn't mind going through those fish and kind of pointing out the things that we might be able to see while we're looking at the fish at the nest. And then I'm going to follow that up with a video, and we're going to put Cherie on the spot to see if she can identify the individual fish. This is a little video that I put together last year, and it's got several different fish. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, and hang on for a minute while I do that. Okay, people should be seeing my screen about this time, and I'm going to start this video. And the presenter's name is Tori Ritter. He's with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and he is giving us a presentation on the fish in the Bitterroot.
Okay, so today I'm just going to talk about some of the fish that you might be seeing come to the nest from that lower Bitterroot area, and I'll try to kind of put those fish into the context of osprey ecology, and then kind of give you a little bit about the fish, the ecology of the fishes as well. So a few things about osprey and fish to kind of help us think about the different fishes and how they fit into the osprey's diet. Of course, 99% of their food is fish. People have seen them grab some other strange things here and there, but it's almost all fish. They've taken over 80 different species of fish. That's across saltwater and freshwater, 30 different species in freshwater. So they can take a really wide variety of species. But generally, they're focused on 2 to 3 different species in most areas. And that can be for all sorts of reasons. It's how vulnerable the fish are to osprey predation. It can be the abundance of the fish. It can be their behaviors. It really just depends. But for the most part, I think it's just whether or not the fish in the area are vulnerable to getting hit by osprey.
And let me ask you about that, Tori. Vulnerability, I would assume, would part of that would be where in the water column they tend to hang out.
Yep, exactly.
They're in the top part or the bottom part. Is that correct?
Yeah, and how deep the water is and whether the water is flat on the surface or riffly. I'll talk about that a little bit individually for each species and what makes them vulnerable or not. So osprey are generally less efficient when they're trying to hunt in areas with thick emergent or submerged vegetation. So emergent is like cattails and willows and things that grow up out of the water.
I'm sorry, but I'm in the middle.
That'll come into play with a few of the species we talk about. They use a really wide variety of hunting techniques, and it'll really depend on the depth of the water or what fish they're targeting. I was on a float the other day and I saw a hunting technique I've never seen osprey do before, and I've seen hundreds and hundreds of osprey hunting attempts. This one came in kind of low on the water and then it just dropped almost like a 90-degree angle, and it skimmed its talons across the water like really fast. And at the very end, it kind of like dunked a little bit and had a whitefish in its claws for a little bit, and then it dropped it. So I think the whitefish just shook enough to get away. But I had never seen one do that before, that really fast, like skim across the water. I've seen them, they'll perch up in a tree and then dive straight down. They'll hover over one spot and then dive straight down. They'll come in really, really low and kind of do like bald eagles do, but they'll just dunk their claws in and grab one. So they're really, really flexible in how they can go after these species. Sorry about that. So benthic feeding fish, meaning fish that feed on the bottom, are the easiest to catch for osprey if they're in shallow waters, which is not always guaranteed. So that's suckers and whitefish on the Bitterroot are kind of considered benthic feeding fish because they're always down on the bottom eating stuff. And we'll talk a little bit about why that makes them vulnerable. In the limnetic zone, which is the area of the water that still gets sunlight and is still lit by sunlight but isn't necessarily really shallow, piscivorous fish, meaning fish that eat other fish, are harder to catch than non-piscivorous fish, and we'll talk about that as well. And I just thought this was interesting. Across all the studies that were compiled in this one report I saw, foraging efficiency was between 19 and 69%. So even the best, most successful ospreys out there in the world that have been studied are still missing over a quarter of the time when they go for a fish. So they're really good, but fish are pretty good at escaping too. So we'll jump into the fish that ospreys might be bringing to the nest. We'll start with the native fish. These are fish that have been in the Bitterroot system, have evolved with all the plants and animals around there since they came into existence. And I'm going to start with the sort of lesser known native fish, or maybe the less respected, I guess, in a way, native fish.
Less sought after by fishermen.
Exactly, yeah. So one of my favorite fish is the northern pike minnow. This is one of the largest fish in the pike minnow family, in the minnow family. So, most minnows are really small fish up to a few inches, but northern pike minnow can get up to 7 pounds. So there's some really, really big fish out there. And especially on the lower Bitterroot, because they like warmer waters, these guys are everywhere, especially the big backwater sloughs and the slower parts of the river. And they're very predatory. They go after fish. They go after everything from little aquatic invertebrates like mayflies and caddisflies all the way up to like mice. I mean, they're really, really aggressive when they get big. Fishermen catch them a lot on streamers, which are flies that mimic small fish. In terms of their vulnerability to ospreys, they are pretty vulnerable because they're pretty dark on the back and you can see them really easily from above. And they tend to be slow moving. Oftentimes they're just holding in the water column and they'll be kind of out in the open quite a bit. and because there's such a big abundance of them. So that makes them pretty vulnerable to osprey because the osprey can see them really well, and they're generally in that kind of flat, slow water that is really easy to see through when you're looking at it from above. So accompanying with each one of these drawings, I just put a picture in. A lot of them are of my brother. I'm a non-game biologist. I'm on the wildlife side, but I've also been obsessed with fly fishing for my whole life. So I have a lot of pictures of these fish. So you'll see my brother a lot in here. So that's my brother, and that's a northern pike minnow we caught out of the Clark Fork River.
So let me just compare them to. I mean, they have the shape of a trout, but they're not. Tell us the differences here. If looking at this, why would you say instantly it's not a trout?
So one thing is it has these kind of lips on it that don't have any teeth on them. And they're really, really prominent. They're just very kind of hard, bony cheeks. And then all along the side is just this sort of dull olive to gold color with these sort of lighter color orangish fins. And, trout will usually have speckling on them and they'll have some brighter colors.
Right.
And they'll also have some pretty different fins. I can't really get into specifics of all the difference in the fins, but it's really worth looking at the different pictures of the fish and getting a good sense of what the fins look like. I won't be able to tell you those specifics because I didn't really prepare that ahead of time, but that's a really good indication. When I was looking at those fish from those pictures you showed me, I was really looking at the fins. One thing about the pike minnow is they have this really heavy fork in the fin, and that's a pretty good, in the tail fin, and that's a pretty good indication of pike minnow. There's not a lot of fish that have that deep fork. And also this very triangular, tall, pointed dorsal fin is also pretty distinctive.
Great.
Yeah.
So do people eat them? I've never fished for pike minnow. Is it pike minnow or peak minnow?
Pike minnow.
Pike minnow, are they edible?
I know that indigenous people used to eat them. I don't know of anybody that eats them now. I don't think they taste great, although I can't say I've tried it myself. They're often considered a trash fish, which is, not really nice to say about any fish, but so people used to just throw them up on the bank because they thought that they competed with trout and people wanted trout around more. But they're definitely not. They're part of the ecosystem. They've been here forever. So I can't really testament to how most people aren't fishing for them. It's kind of just happens while you're fishing for trout. You randomly get one of these.
Okay.
So another really abundant native fish in the Bitterroot are suckers. We have a long-nosed sucker and a large-scale sucker. Long-nosed sucker is just in the western part of the state. Large-scale sucker is all over the entire state. It's in almost every water body. These are both native fish. They get really, really big, so they can get up to like 30 inches long. They're giant, big fish. And they're very dark backs. If you're floating down the river and you see a bunch of really huge fish swimming around in the bottom of the deep holes, those are almost always the large-scale suckers. And these are those benthic feeding fish. So these are on the bottom. They have these kind of sucker mouths, and they're just going along the rocks, sucking up worms or crustaceans or anything that kind of gets in their way. They're vulnerable to osprey if they're small, if they're juveniles, and they're in shallow water. But that doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, they're really big and they're really deep. So I have seen osprey carrying them around. Usually it's one that's almost too big for the osprey to carry. So you're seeing the osprey like really struggling to fly. But yeah, I don't think they're quite as common. You'll see they do have a forked tail as well. It's not as prominent though as the pike minnow. It's a little more smoothed out. And then notice that fin that has that kind of, the back end of the dorsal fin doesn't connect down to the body. That's a pretty good indication of a sucker, although we'll see some of the like largemouth bass and pike can also have that. But really, really big fins on the lower part. And if you can see the mouth, that's pretty distinctive because it's the only one that has a mouth that's sort of facing down and has a big sucker thing on it.
And using that as an identifier, they have shown up at the Dunrobin nest. The suckers have. Okay.
Yeah. There's so many of them on the river. I'm sure they get pretty common opportunities to get the smaller ones. I should have warned you about that photo. But you kind of see that we don't catch suckers very often, so he was very excited. Like how different these fish can look in real life. I mean, this one's really orange, and you can see that. This is what the sucker mouth looks like when it's protruding. So it's kind of this big structure on the front. But those big giant fins are a pretty good indication. This is a mountain whitefish. It's hard to say whether suckers or whitefish are the most abundant fish in the Bitterroot. It probably depends on what section you're in. Suckers like warmer, lower end of the river, slower waters. Whitefish are in faster, riffly, colder waters. So probably as you move from the top of the system down to where it flows in the Clark Fork, you probably shift from more whitefish to more suckers. But these are another native fish. They have a pointy little mouth. It's kind of like a sucker, but it is more forward facing. And it's very tough. It's like tough cartilage kind of. And what they're doing is they form these big schools, and they're in the substrate, just poking around among the rocks, rooting around in the gravel, and just sucking up little invertebrates, the mayflies and stoneflies and caddisflies, just sucking those up all over the river. So what you'll see sometimes is these big, massive groups of mountain whitefish, especially in spawning season. There's hundreds and hundreds of them. And you'll actually see trout move in below them, and the trout will start feeding on all the stuff that the whitefish are kicking up and not actually getting into their mouths. So that's a really common game fish for osprey. Most of the ospreys I've seen on the upper river, almost always when they're carrying food, and I can see what it is, it's a whitefish, because these are all over the place in the Bitterroot. They hold in shallow water. They're not nearly as spooky as other fish. If you go snorkeling, you'll often see them just hanging right around you. They're not zipping off like the trout are. So they're really, really common fish. Are you seeing those a lot at the nest?
Well, I haven't seen them so many times at the nest, but then again, I'm not sure that I correctly identified them. But we do have a number of places right here in front of our property where you can fish whitefish in the winter, and they're very good smoked.
Yeah, they are really, really good.
They're really good smoked. So I have fished for, and I've had friends who've come out and have fished for whitefish right out here. So I'm certain that the ospreys are bringing them. But again, looking at some of the distinctive features, I see a little bit of green on the fin here, on the tail fin. And other than that, it's really kind of whitish. Is that true to form here?
Yeah, I wouldn't rely on the green on the tail. I haven't ever found that to be distinctive. This will be the hardest one to distinguish from the pike minnow, unless you can see the face, the head. Their jaws are completely different. You'd never mistake the jaws for a whitefish for pike minnow. Pike minnow has big, big mouth. Whitefish, this little tiny pokey mouth. But if you're just seeing the back half of them, the color is probably going to be the best indication you have. Whitefish in the Bitterroot are pretty light color. They have this light kind of golden color, and they don't have a really prominent line going down the side. And their fins are lighter color than those pike minnows. But they definitely have a lot of overlap. Let me just go back to the pike minnow and see if there's...
Yeah.
They're pretty close, but you can see that really prominent line down the pike minnow. And the color of the fin, they have a lot thicker fin, and it's the whitefish is almost see-through. It's very kind of light color, and you can see through it really well, where those pike minnows will have a darker, thicker fin. Yeah, this is another fish that people used to chuck up on shore, but now most fly fish or people that fly fish pretty much agree that if you're having a really hard time catching trout, you can almost always catch whitefish because they're everywhere and they're very eager to take a fly. So, yeah, that's a really common fish. I was going to show you this. So these are the fish on the Bitterroot. They're really, really light colored because the substrate in the Bitterroot is fairly light color. These were some whitefish we caught in Idaho that were in a stream that was covered with basalt rocks on the bottom. So it was really, really dark. And I just thought it was cool that those fish seem to have evolved in some way, or, you know, a lot of fish can actually change their color pretty well, depending on how stressed they are or what they're doing. So I don't know if these ones are doing that or if they've just kind of evolved to have a darker color, but it was just kind of cool to see that difference. So moving on to our native trout, this is the West Slope cutthroat trout. It's the only native trout. Well, no, sorry. It's one of two native trout that we have in the Bitterroot River system. So this is a really famous fish, really, really beautiful. This was one that I caught up in Scalco Creek down in the Bitterroot. So they can look very, very different. But the really distinctive thing is they have that slash under their throat. A lot of times they won't be this red unless it's spawning season, which is June and July. But red slash under the throat, and then the speckling that kind of is centered just all around the tail and tapers up and gets less so near the top. You can kind of see that on this one. This one has a few more speckles near the gill plate and the eye, but really heavy spotting in the back that sort of tapers away towards the front. In the lower Bitterroot, where the ospreys at Dunroven Ranch are probably hunting, most of the cutthroats I've seen down there are pretty light, kind of golden color, and the spots aren't as prominent as in these two pictures. So the spots are a little bit lighter and a little bit smaller. But they have a pretty distinctive look from the other trout you'll see. So if you nail down that it's a trout, and then it has that sort of speckling and it has that light golden color, it'll be really hard to mistake that for other fish, except for potentially rainbow trout, and we'll talk about why that is. Well, we can talk about it here. So you may see what's called a cutbow, and that's a hybrid between a cutthroat trout and a rainbow. So you can have everything. So if there's like 1% rainbow trout in a West Slope cutthroat, it'll look a lot like a West Slope cutthroat. But if there's 60% of the genes of a rainbow trout in a West Slope cutthroat, in a hybrid, it may look literally like half rainbow, half cutthroat. So you might see some of that speckling pattern, but then there's the bright rainbow colors on its side. Or you might see none of that speckling pattern, and it almost looks exactly like a rainbow, but it has the red slash under the throat. So if you're identifying cutthroats and rainbows coming to the nest, you may want to have sort of a scale or just have rainbow, cutbow, cutthroat, and cutbow can be your category when you really can't tell, is it a cutthroat or is it a rainbow, because it's kind of in between. So that one can be a little bit tricky. And even professional fish biologists often can't tell the difference between cutbows and rainbows or cutbows and cutthroats in the field. So there's a lot of that.
Tori, would you address that issue? West Slope cutthroat are native to the Bitterroot. Rainbows are not. They're introduced.
Yep.
And so what is the ecological problem with an introduced species like this that interbreeds with the native species? What kinds of ecological problems are presented by that?
Well, it's interesting because their hybridization with rainbows doesn't really change the ecological niche that they fill that much. It changes their behavior a little bit. It changes their growth patterns a little bit, but they're still available to all the fish that eat them, and they still eat the same things that they would if they weren't hybridized. So it's almost more of I don't even know what the right term would be, but it's more about the preservation of a native species, of genetically pure West Slope cutthroat trout that evolved in these streams, evolved with all the plant animal species around. So it's almost more of a social thing. Like, we really want to preserve these native species because they're so social and uniquely adapted. There are also probably some weird genes that could come in when you're hybridizing with fish that were raised in a hatchery. We don't introduce hatchery fish into our rivers anymore. It's all wild, fish that spawn in the creeks. So we don't have to worry about that too much anymore, but it certainly introduces genes that weren't developed and kind of honed within the ecosystem where the native fish are.
So they may not be as robust because the native species have evolved for this particular set of environmental circumstances. And by introducing genes of fish that are not as robust, that could be detrimental in terms of their survival. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. Fish reproduce a lot and they reproduce really fast, so they can adapt to conditions really well. But certainly when you have foreign genes coming in that weren't from a fish that evolved in this area, that can definitely sort of be an issue for that native population. And you also have with warming, the real big problem with West Slope cutthroat is warming temperatures. They're very sensitive to water temperature, and rainbows aren't. So rainbows will start hybridizing with cutthroat trout, and as waters start to warm, and you have to go further and further up the canyons to get to cold water on the spawning tributaries, those rainbows just keep kind of marching up and upstream further and further. and you can have a hybridized system all the way to the end of the drainage.
So global warming would be much more detrimental to the cutthroat trout than the rainbow trout.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And we can see that throughout time. The data of West Slope cutthroat, genetically pure West Slope cutthroat trout distribution is just slowly shrinking into the mountains where those cold, clear streams are left.
Yeah. Yeah. They're indicator species in that regard, then, I would think.
Yep. Exactly.
Thank you.
Kind of on that note, the next species we're going to talk about is bull trout, which is the other native trout species in Montana. And these guys are on the threatened and endangered species list. They're listed as threatened. We're kind of on the edge of their range here in Montana. So they're most abundant and doing the best in northwest Montana, and they're really struggling in the Missoula area. And these fish are even more tied to water temperature and water quality. So these fish are really, really suffering because there aren't very many cold, clear creeks left for them to spawn in. And in a lot of the cold, clear tributary creeks they used to spawn in, the history of logging in this area has created a lot of roads and a lot of soil instability that leads to sedimentation, where really fine particulate matter runs off the hillsides, gets into the creeks, and then it settles out and fills in all the spaces between the gravels. And those spaces are where fish spawn. So that's where they lay their eggs, and they need those spaces between the gravel because that's what keeps oxygen and nutrients moving through the gravel where the eggs are growing. So when all that sediment settles down in those spaces, it either chokes out the eggs completely or it just makes it so that the spawning gravel isn't as suitable. So bull trout are really struggling. They're a really cool fish, really predatory. They can get to be huge. They can get up to be like 30 plus inches, just absolutely giant fish. So they've been targeted a lot by poachers because people like to catch really big fish. And they just have a very, very retracted range. It's actually illegal to purposefully fish for bull trout in Montana. So if you're up on a cold, clear stream and you see a giant fish down there and you can tell it's a bull trout and you purposely start casting at it, that's actually illegal in Montana. And that's just kind of a testament to how much these fish are struggling, that we're actually, legal methods to try to prevent people from even doing catch and release fishing, even harass them in any way because they're so sensitive. But they have amazing life histories. They spawn many miles way up to these headwater streams. These big giant fish are leaping over these log jams. They're crawling their way up through these huge log jams and waterfalls and all this, and going on these amazing spawning runs. So it's a really cool fish, but really, really struggling. Both West Slope cutthroat and bull trout are pretty rare relative to other trout in the lower Bitterroot because it has a lot warmer water temperatures than the rest of the system. But Lolo Creek running in down there really puts in a lot of cold water. So you will still see bull trout and West Slope cutthroat around, mostly because they can hang out near the mouths of those cold, clear tributaries. I'm guessing you probably haven't seen a bull trout come to the Osprey nest.
I don't believe that I have, but I'm not 100% sure that I would have recognized it. No.
Oh, yeah. I keep forgetting to talk about. So in terms of identifying trout, you won't see the forked tail on trout. So that's a really good indication when you have a trout in the nest. You won't have the forked tail, and you'll have a lot more of the spotting for the different trout species. Bull trout and brook trout can look fairly similar. I'll show you some differences there. But generally silver overall, and it has the kind of orangish spots. And this one obviously looks a lot different than that photo, so you can kind of see the differences you might see. So this one obviously a lot more kind of golden color, but it has those orange spots, usually with a light halo, and they'll often have the white tipped fins as well. So those are our only two native trout in the system. And that is it for the native fish that Osprey might be bringing in. There's also native fish like sculpins and minnows out there, but it's really unlikely that an Osprey would be bringing one of those back because they're all really small. So we'll move on to the non-native fish in the lower Bitterroot. And one I think that you mentioned you're seeing a lot of is the northern pike. Is that right?
Yes, we have, particularly this year, Tori. I haven't noticed them as prevalent in previous years, and maybe it's the fishing preference of the particular male osprey. But we've seen a number of them come in. They can get pretty large.
Yes, they can. I'll show you a picture of one from the lower Bitterroot after this that was quite big. So this one, really easy to tell, that long pointed snout with a big mouth. No other fish in the Bitterroot has that. And also you'll see these big fins at the back that are kind of almost equal in size and on top and bottom. That's also really distinctive of pike. Pike should be pretty easy to identify from all of the other fishes because of those weird fins and that weird head. So that should be pretty easy to do. So this is a non-native fish. It's considered invasive in a lot of areas because they're really aggressive predators, and they'll eat almost anything. They'll eat small ducks, snakes, frogs, lizards. They'll eat pretty big fish. There's a lot of videos out there of pike that have actually choked to death trying to eat fish that were too big for their mouths. So they're really aggressive. They can reproduce really quickly, and have a lot of them. So in systems where northern pike have taken over, you often get to the point where you just have a bunch of northern pike that are all the same length. They're like 15 to 25 inches, and they're all the same size, and there's just tons of them, and they're everywhere, and there's almost no other fish around. And that's what can sometimes happen with northern pike because they're so aggressive. They're an ambush predator, so they're almost always in really slow or mostly still water, sitting down in the vegetation or under a log or under an overhanging tree and just waiting for something to come by, and then they rush out and grab it. So people that fish really like them because they're aggressive and they chase streamers, and I've heard they're actually pretty good to eat. But ecologically, they can be a bad situation because they're feeding on so many different species, including others that we're concerned about, like ducks and frogs and those sorts of things. But they are really vulnerable to osprey because they like to hang out in shallow water, warm, shallow water, and they stay still, and they're big and easy to see. So that's probably why you're seeing a lot of them showing up, because all those sloughs and ponds around there are just filled with young pike, and they're just out in the open all the time because they're really not used to things eating them. So it's a good target for an osprey. So this was a northern pike that I caught on the Bitterroot, probably 3 or 4 miles above Dunroven Ranch. So you can imagine something that big, a duckling or a snake or something like that, is really nothing to that. That thing is just going to gobble it right up. So when you get a bunch of those in the system, they are the top predator underwater, and they are an apex predator. There's nearly nothing that eats them once they get that big. And that's these size fish are the real danger, because they will just swim around eating up trout and pike minnow and all the native fish, or all the game fish that people really want. So another one that I just remembered before this presentation started, there are largemouth bass in the lower Bitterroot. They're pretty rare. And I think I saw one of these in the photos that you showed me. But these ones have this really unique dorsal fin. It's very spiky. So a lot of times you'll see people that fish grabbing the whole bass by their lip. And that's because if you try to grab them by the body, the spines on the fins are really spiky and hurt a lot. So this one, again, no fork in the tail, almost always a green color on the body with this dark stripe down the side. And you'll see that this is called the lateral line. This is actually a sensory organ on fish, has that curve to it. I think that's pretty distinctive for trout, or for bass. Big mouth, but those fins are really distinctive. Again, they're kind of like the fins of the pike in the back, but it also has this front fin here, which is distinctive. And compared to a pike, it also doesn't have as forked of a tail in the back. This one is almost always in still water. I've never seen one in the moving water. I've only caught maybe 3 in 20 years of fishing the Bitterroot. So they're pretty rare, but they are really vulnerable to osprey, again, because they're just sitting there in the water column, just like pike, and they're dark color on the back, so they're pretty easy to see from above.
So, Tori, When you're
Mhm.
talking about these fish, can you give us an indication of how they got here? For example, the pike and the bass, were those what you call, midnight bucket fish? Fishermen dump them in the stream so that they could have them to fish. Is that basically how they got here?
Yep, that's exactly right. So, like rainbow trout and brown trout were stocked by state game agencies. They still are in some areas. So those all come from stocked populations a long time ago. They're very wild now. They've reproduced in the river for many generations, but they were introduced on purpose. In this area, largemouth bass and northern pike were likely introduced by people that wanted to have them. Yeah, bucket biology, exactly what you were saying. People that wanted to fish for them but didn't realize the potential ecological harm they could be causing by doing that. Bass are another common predator of baby turtles and frogs and ducklings and things like that. They don't get nearly as big as pike, but they do eat a lot of those things. So there wasn't really a species that was filling that niche here before the pike and bass showed up. That niche being in the backwaters and the ponds and being ambush predators. We didn't have many fish like that except maybe the pike minnow. So that's a new predator, a new type of predator here for those native wildlife that they haven't evolved with and that they're not used to. So these fish can be pretty harmful. And I didn't even have a picture of anybody with a northern bass they caught, so there's just a photo of what they look like underwater. Again, dark line down the side and that sort of double fin on top is really distinctive. So the last three fish we'll talk about are the non-native trout. So these are the game fish species, the one that you see all those people fishing on the river and floating by all the time. These are the ones they're really going after the most. These and the West Slope cutthroat. So rainbow trout is the most widespread trout in the world. If it wasn't such an important game fish, it would be considered one of the most invasive species on the entire planet. They can survive a huge range of conditions. There's all sorts of subspecies out there. They've been introduced to water bodies throughout the entire world, and they're very, very prolific. They survive really well despite any sort of conditions or any sort of adverse conditions. So they're just everywhere. But they're really beautiful. They're really fun to catch on a fly rod. They still do provide, food for ospreys and food for other fish. So they're not like bass and pike where they can kind of take over the system and cause this really big ecological disruption. But they do, like I said, hybridize with West Slope cutthroats and compete for food with those native fish. So you'd probably be pretty likely to see these coming into the osprey nest. Is that true? You see them? Yeah.
And they're pretty easy to identify. By color, and then they have that little fin before the tail on the top. What do you call that fin?
That is the adipose fin.
Adipose fin.
Yep, and all trout have those. I think, I don't remember if the West Slope does. Yeah, all trout have that adipose fin. But on rainbows, you will see the white tips on the bottoms of the lower fins. And again, you may have that range of fish between West Slope cutthroats and hybrids and pure rainbows. But mostly rainbows have the dark olive back and a big pink or red stripe down the middle. And then compared to the cutthroat, you'll notice that spotting is really even across the whole body. Whereas with the cutthroat, it was really concentrated towards the back. So that's distinctive for the rainbow trout as well.
So, Tori, where were rainbow trout native? Where do they originate from?
So rainbow trout are native in like Alaska and along the Pacific British coast. I don't think they were native anywhere on the East Coast. They're native in Russia, I believe. I'm going to get this wrong. I don't know where exactly they're native, but we do have native populations in northwest Montana, really, really isolated small populations called red band rainbow trout. And then there's also species that migrate between salt and fresh water, which are called steelhead.
Yeah.
The rainbow trout species, I think the term is Andromedus.
Adronomus. Yeah, I used to study salmon in Alaska. And in fact, I do believe that what they call Atlantic salmon are actually steelhead. Salmonoids are from the Pacific, I believe.
Okay.
I have to look that up. Yeah.
But yeah, I've caught lots of these rainbow trout down there. They're all over in that lower river.
Yeah, well, and salmon have been introduced into the southern hemisphere in Chile and New Zealand.
Oh yeah, that's true. I remember there's like some big movement to protect a watershed in there, even though it's all non-native fish or protected fish. Yeah. So just to show you, kind of rainbow trout can obviously look very different. Here's one that's covered in tons and tons of spots, but you still see that white tip, the white tip fins. That's not always going to be there. So if you don't see that, it doesn't mean it's not a rainbow. But if it is there, it's almost always a rainbow. And so these are pretty vulnerable to osprey because they're everywhere in the river and they're bold and they hang out in shallow water and they're feeding near the surface a lot, which makes them vulnerable. So they're a lot more vulnerable than our next species, which is the brown trout. Brown trout are much more predatory. They like deeper waters. They like to be under cover a lot more often. They almost never come into shallow water unless it's to feed, and that's almost always at night when ospreys aren't hunting. So they're much harder to get unless they're pretty small. And then sometimes they act a little bit more like rainbow trout. But for the most part, they hold deeper and are less likely to be out in the open. They have this beautiful golden color, dark brown on the back. They can be anywhere from really, really light brown to really, really dark. And they change, they get really, really bright and golden color in the fall when they're spawning. The red spots along the side with the light halo is very distinctive. Remember, the bull trout had those orange or pink color. Brown trout will have the deep red color. And then the kind of golden color fins. These are pretty distinctive. They're pretty hard to mess up between a rainbow trout or a cutthroat or any other trout. They're the only fish that's that dark golden brown color. And here's one that doesn't have the red spots on the side, but again, it's so distinctive because of that brown and gold color.
Thank you, everyone, for watching this. And I was really happy to have Tori Ritter here last year. I'm sorry he couldn't come this year, but he really gave us a good overview of the fish that are in the Bitterroot River. And James, I'm going to ask you if you can share screens with Cherie now. I have another video that I would like to show people here that would kind of test her ability. And I know this is something that I showed people last year and we got to guessing which fish was which, but I think it'd be fun to have Cherie on at the same time. So I'm going to do this right now. Let me see if I can, first of all, get the video panel back up so I can see Cherie. Yes, I can see her now. Okay. Let's play this little video, and I'll stop it for each fish, Cherie, so you can give us a guess, all right?
All right.
All right, these are all taken last year. Only one chick last year. Okay, Cherie. Now, I'll go forward a little bit. You can maybe tell me if I should stop again to get a better view of that fish. There we go. All right. That's actually a fairly good view of a fish. And what are you looking at?
So the first thing I saw was, like a lot of fish that come on, is the dark back, which is what makes them able to see them in the water. But as they flip over, you can now see the light belly and those orange fins. Sorry. And those orange fins. But what I'm looking at specifically on this fish, Bella, is that downward facing mouth.
Yeah.
So that tells me that this is one of those bottom feeder, benthic feeders that is going around plucking stuff off the bottom. So without more, I'm going to guess either a large scale or a long nose sucker, like Tori was talking about. Just mostly based on dark back, light belly, downward mouth.
Yeah, the downward mouth is a real giveaway, and that's a a good view of it, isn't it? You don't always get a good view. Yeah. So let's go
Usually
on.
they come headless.
I think you're right. And if anybody wants to chime in on the chat, we'd really appreciate your participation. Let's go on. This one chick was overfed last year. His name was Lucky, for those of you who were not with us last year. There he goes. Here comes fish two. All right, now here we're getting some pretty good looks at that fish. I'll go ahead and stop again here. All right, let's take a look there. What you're looking at, Cherie?
Well, I'd love to have some chat guesses too while I talk through it. This one we have a nice view of, honestly, and you could see the dark green and those vertical stripes is what stands out to me. Honestly, with the views that we get on the nest, I really have started to rely on size and color. And then if you can get a closer look, then you can look at, does it have a forked tail, or like what color are the fins? So on this one, I see those vertical stripes and the shape of the fish, and then those bright yellow fins on the underneath. And I believe this is a yellow perch.
Yeah. We don't always get this good a look. Okay, here comes fish number 3. All right, now let's see if we get a better look. Okay, now we got a pretty good look there, and it's pretty distinctive, isn't it?
Very distinctive fish. That long body is kind of a giveaway.
Yeah.
You could see some of the spots on there too, those asymmetrical oblong markings. And I think there's a zoom in too on where you could see the face and see that shovel nose, and you could tell that this is a northern pike.
Yep. And I'm always glad to see him bring those. They are invasive for sure. Okay.
It's a nice meal too.
Yeah, great big meal. Exactly. So I'm sure that everybody who's watching is recognizing that these chicks just, holler and scream when they see a fish coming their way. And this year with 3 big chicks, it's just filling the air certain times of the day. You can hardly work out there. Isn't that right, Cherie? I mean, early in the morning and about midday, and again late at night or late in the evening, it's just pandemonium out there.
Or you can tell when something's happening. They make a lot of noise.
They do. For those of you watching, this is the same male. Ooh. Okay, Cherie, now here you have a disadvantage. It's headless, and a lot of headless fish come to the nest. So what are you looking at here?
I mean, it's huge. This is a great big fish. I would like to see how big it was with the head still on too. Right off the bat on this view, I think the color stands out. that nice golden color with the dark back. I think it goes on, gets a much better.
Yeah. Okay. Let me go on a little bit more here.
Can't even get a hold of it.
Yeah. Okay, there's a better view now. So what are you looking at here?
So from here you can see some spotting, some of those black spots that look to be evenly distributed across the back, not like the cutthroat where it kind of starts at the back and trickles forward, but this is kind of evenly distributed. And you can tell that also trout giveaway again is the forked tail and how it does not have a forked tail. And again, just looking at that color, the dark brown on top, kind of fading into golden fins on the bottom. And if you look closely, you can see a few red spots underneath, below those black spots, kind of interspersed in there. And that was the
right here. You can see some.
Yeah, the identifying factor for me for this one. I think it's which one had the brown trout?
Yeah, I would agree.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That this is tough. This is really
There's
tough.
so much variation too.
Yeah, you can tell it's a trout, but you're not. I mean, it's probably not a rainbow trout for sure, but it gets really tricky. Yeah, good call. These young ones seem to like to hold their fish for a while and contemplate their prize, don't you think?
See, there you can see those red spots.
Yep, very, very distinctly right here. You can see them right there. Yep, line of them. And that kind of a notch in the tail.
Right.
Right. And here's the adipose fin right here. So very consistent with the trout. The last one, the live one.
Live one.
Yep. So what are you thinking?
It's a good sized fish. Not small, not huge. Color, it's a very light color. And as it's flopping around there, you can kind of see the face, which is nice to have on as an indicator for this one, since it is flopping around so much. You can see it has that kind of pointed face. Definitely not downward facing or anything like that. Very much forward. And then I think as it's flopping around, you can see the fork tail. So fork and tail. We have that. It looks to be just one uniform color and not with any spots or anything. So, and maybe keep playing it so I can see the fins.
Yep.
Remember, he said, they can sometimes be hard to tell between the whitefish and the pike minnow, and it'll be those fins that can help you. So that was a light-colored fish.
Yeah, I would say the pike minnow, wouldn't you?
Hard to tell.
Hard to tell. Let me get.
Good morning, everyone, from Dunroven Ranch in Lolo, Montana.
Oh dear, that's an old one. Here. So thank you, Cherie. I really appreciate that. And this is the kind of thing that we try to do. When the web camera went up the very first year, their whole purpose was to monitor and identify the fish that came to the nest. And so what they did is they recorded it, and they had a graduate student go through it. And it took them months to identify each one of the fish. And it was a much grainier web camera. So you can see just how challenging a task that really was. Okay, so I'm going to move on to reading this Facebook post that was put on by Montana Osprey. And I think people will really enjoy the story. And I think you probably know something about this. Do you not, Cherie? Are you still in contact with the people at Montana Osprey?
Not as much this summer, no. The only thing I know about this is what you've seen as well.
Okay, well, I'm going to read it because it's very interesting. They say, whew, what a day. Here is an update on Kona, the osprey chick. We decided to do something we have not done before. Put an osprey chick in another nest with different parents. Why, you ask? This was called cross-fostering, and ospreys are known for being great at adopting chicks that are not their own. Kona's older sibling has fledged, and so that family is not spending as much time at the nest. Also, the nest is very near high voltage power lines, which makes us nervous. Also, the second chick that was badly tangled in baling twine that we rescued yesterday at the Steinbrenner's house was an only chick. We were worried that if it rehabbed with Brooke for a week or so, the parents might abandon the nest and migrate. So by putting Kona in the Steinbrenner's nest, if the adoption went okay, the parents would stick around to take care of their new charge. And then in a week or so, when their chick is healed up, we are planning on putting the chick back up with Kona. So there was a nest that had a rehab chick that may keep the parents around longer, and they wanted to put this chick in that nest in the hopes that it would take care of it and before they migrated. So how did it go? Rob Dominich and I never cross-fostered the chicks, so we were all holding our breath. The parents were not around when Rob and Jeff put Kona in the nest, but we're delighted to see that Kona is really vigorously and feisty flapperizing. Everybody knows what that is. They're flapping their wings, walking around the nest and calling to the adults. Rob put 2 nice trout in the nest before heading down. I thought that was interesting too, Cherie, because normally osprey won't take fish that they didn't catch, but evidently these guys did. We waited in suspense for a while, and then both the male and the female flew in. The male had caught a whitefish, and he went to the tree and ate the head off. The female was extremely interested in the chick and landed on the nest. She and Kona looked at each other, and there was absolutely no aggression. The female grabbed one of the trout and flew off to a nearby tree to eat. Kona figured, what the heck, and chowed down on the other trout. In a little while, the female flew back to the nest, and Katie Steinbrenner, who had first noticed the chick tangled up and immediately contacted us, reported that the new mom and Kona spent the afternoon side by side, getting to know one another and chowing down on fish. We are delighted to report that Kona, who would probably have died by now, has a new lease on life with a new adoptive set of parents. Isn't this interesting? And I'm sure they'll keep us posted on updates as this story unfolds. But I knew people would be interested in this little episode of cross fostering. So I thought I would share that with everyone. Thank you again, Cherie, for the hard work that you've done putting all of this together for us. And we are going to meet again next week to talk about birds and ospreys in flight. And we appreciate your presence. And if you have any questions now or even in the future, drop us an email or go on the discussion board on our website. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, we'll say goodbye. Thank you all, and thank you, Cherie and James.